He would trade his tired shoes for a moment of peace. She would trade a boardroom full of advisors for a life that did not require pretending. The city glittered in glass and rain, two windows facing the same sky but showing different weather. He arrived at the wedding carrying an invitation that smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon polish. She walked past the valet wrapped in a silk dress and a history that refused to be simple. Power and need met on a wet evening. The collision promised a truth no headline could contain. Stay with me, because this is about what we give up to be seen and what we ask back when we finally decide to ask. The contrast was immediate, almost painful. On one side, a man named Jonah Reyes, a single father who timed his life by school bells and bus routes, who kept a faded wristwatch his son had given him, and paid bills in envelopes folded with care. On the other, Whitman, CEO of a philanthropic foundation and the kind of executive who could silence a board with a look, whose public persona was curated down to a practiced smile. What separated them was not only money, it was legacy, unspoken guilt, a secret that had tightened Claire's jaw for years. The invitation linked them, the edge of its paper a thin line between what had been and what might be returned. A small image made everything converge. The invitation itself slipped into Jonah's pocket by mistake when he collected a folded program at the wrong table. He did not notice until later when he turned it over and saw her name printed in copperplate, an exclamation that felt like a question. She did not notice him at first, because the wedding was an event built to make people look away from their private wounds and toward the public illusion of perfection. But an umbrella left in the lobby and a parking ticket with his name would nudge them both into the same orbit. This is a story about second chances that do not arrive like miracles. They arrive like decisions made in quiet places. He walked into the room carrying the smell of coffee, rain, and the faintly medicinal scent of the clinic where his son had been treated months earlier. He felt small in a rented jacket, the fabric thin against his shoulders. She entered with the light of flashbulbs and a dress designed to make the city pause. There would be a moment, mid-reception, when an accidental glance would undo the distance both had spent years building. There would be choices, legal questions, and little domestic triumphs. In the end, someone would learn what they must make room for. That is the promise. Jonah had been a mechanic by trade and a father by design. He grew up in a narrow house where the air always smelled of oil and fried plantains, where mornings began with the hiss of a kettle and the scrape of a wrench against metal. He learned to fix what he could and to steady things that were not steady by promising them steady hands. At 20, he became a parent after a wrong turn and a hospital corridor conversation that held both breath and resignation. He took a job that would let him leave early enough to meet the school bus. He worked nights, cleaning offices when money ran thin. The tactile memory of grease under his nails came with a tenderness he did not advertise. He loved the small rituals with his son Mateo, such as burning toast together and laughing about it, making a game of imperfect breakfast. Then Mateo fell ill in a way the doctors called complicated. Clinics and prescriptions became routine, and Jonah learned the language of billing codes, co-pays, and waiting room magazines. He sold a part of his small inheritance to keep a roof above their heads when a landlord suddenly raised the rent. He learned that pride could cost a child more than money. Jonah wanted above all to be present, to be enough, and to find a way to rebuild the quiet life that illness had threatened. The invitation he later pocketed felt like a small baited promise of crossing a threshold he had avoided for years. Claire had been raised in an apartment that overlooked a river, in a house where conversations were measured by legacies, and where silence could mean an inheritance. Her father had been a partner at a bank known for its discreet ways and quicker hands. She learned early that power was a language that opened doors and closed mouths. She studied finance and law in the same breath, an education that carved out a steel spine beneath a polite smile. Love, to her, had once been a ledger entry, and then it had been Jonah. They had known each other in a way that neither paper nor board could explain in simple terms. The breakup had been courteous in public and brutal in private. A mistake in their youth had created distance, and years of ambition had grown into a fortress. When Claire rose to lead a foundation, she believed she was making reparations of a sort, funding pediatric clinics and scholarships in places where children needed clean air and steady hands. Yet behind the polished statements was a decision she kept quiet, a concession she had made to protect an old secret that involved a contract signed in haste and a payment shifted to legal accounts. That choice cost her sleep and built a habit of stepping over her own needs. Her priority became control, but control had a limit. She wanted to be noticed for who she could be rather than what she had inherited, and she wanted to imagine a life that included more noise and less silence. The wedding would be a show of success, but also a test of courage she had not anticipated. The invitation was a thin, living thing in Jonah's pocket all evening. When he found it, his heart gave a small, traitorous lurch. He had not expected to be invited. He had not expected to see Claire's name in calligraphy and to read an RSVP line that seemed written for more than guests. He debated leaving, but the rain folded the city into a small, warm world, and he let curiosity carry him. A valet handed out umbrellas, and a volunteer named Priya smiled and asked if he needed help. He fumbled, said no, and the umbrella left its scent of wet polyester on his jacket sleeve. In another room, Claire adjusted a cuff with the exactitude of someone removing armor. She noticed him across a shimmer of champagne and an angular sculpture. There was a pulse of recognition, quiet and jagged, like a clock that had been stopped and then wound again. They did not start with clarity. The first exchanges were small, ritualized. "Jonah," she said, as if the name itself required rehearsal. "Claire," he answered. Then they paused, two adults measuring old vulnerability against current lives. There was an audience of friends and colleagues, including Marcus, a longtime PR consultant, Elena, her chief of staff, Sophie, the bride's cousin, and David, a hedge fund manager, who clapped at the wrong moment. Later, Maya, a neighbor from Jonah's building, would recount the scene at the grocery store, and Javier, a teacher at Mateo's school, would later help Jonah with a letter for custody. Each person would leave fingerprints on the story by responding in small ways, by offering a chair or an opinion or a forwarded article to a group chat. "Why are you here?" Claire asked, and the question sounded softer than she intended. Jonah shifted his weight, feeling the rubber soles of his shoes flatten against a new carpet. "I found the invitation," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It felt like something I should not be left with." She let out a breath, and for a moment they were two people pulling at the same thread. "I kept hoping you would not come," she admitted. "I kept hoping things could stay the way they are." He looked at her and saw the lines at the edge of her eyes, evidence that even iron can show wear. "I am here for Mateo," he said, "and for whatever truth this night decides to let out." They moved into conversation with a gravity that sat in the room like a third person. Jonah asked about the foundation and the clinics. Claire asked about Mateo and his treatments. They spoke about small things, but each sentence carried a subtext heavy as freight. The bride's Aunt Sophie joked to ease the air and was rewarded by a polite, if forced, laugh. Marcus mentioned a donation, and Claire answered in a business tone that slid back and forth between public speech and confession. At one point, a server passed and spilled a tray of canapes, the sound like a punctuation mark, and both flinched as if startled by the noise of an honest life. At the 30% mark of the night, the narrative pauses to consider something larger. If this had been a headline, it would read a certain way. In life, the details matter. So I will ask you, after seeing this, to pause in the comments and answer something small. If this scene touches you, you are not alone. Stories like this tug at our memory of who we were and who we want to be. Tell us in the comments one small gesture that reminds you who you are on hard days. Start your comment with, "For me." Your words help others feel less alone and give us ideas for future stories. Now come back to the scene. The moment the pianist slowed and the light softened, what happened when Jonah stepped out onto the terrace? On the terrace, the city air pressed in. salt and exhaust mingling with the scent of pine from nearby planters. Jonah held his son Mateo's drawing in his hand as if it were an incantation. The paper smudged at the corner with a child's finger paint, a sun with too many rays. Claire found him there, fingers wrapped around a cup of espresso that had gone lukewarm. They spoke as if they were reconstructing a road map for where they had lost each other. "You always carried a map," Jonah said, remembering a backpack from years ago, something he had given her during a night when they could barely afford rent. "You were better at maps than I ever was." "I abandoned roads," Claire said. "I traded them for plans." The terrace light pooled on their faces, and a waiter walked by offering dessert as if the world had not dropped its voice for them. They had a dozen exchanges, each one revealing or repairing little pieces of a shared past. The conversation stuttered, stopped, and restarted with small confessions. Later that night, a detail surfaced not meant for ceremony. A discarded envelope found behind a piano had the name of Claire's foundation written in a shorthand that implied transfer. Someone had misplaced a contract page. It moved like a rumor, from table to table, murmured at the edge of a laughter that had no teeth. That misplaced page would become the key that opened a locked office. It would lead to a ledger entry that made a line on a spreadsheet look like an omission, and then like a choice. The revelation was less cinematic than legalese would permit it to be. It began with a footnote. The first moment of public tension came when a journalist at the reception named Robert, who had been a friend of the family for years, asked a question aloud that rolled into an awkward silence. "Is everything above board?" he said, a small jolt meant to be casual. There was a pause long enough to taste. Claire's smile closed. She answered with corporate language, measured and precise, but Jonah felt the air change as if pressure had shifted before a storm. People leaned in, forks paused in midair, and the pianist misplayed a chord. That pause was a decision point for Claire, and her answer would lead to more than a momentary embarrassment. Back inside, Elena and Marcus convened in a corner to decide whether to spin or to own. They chose to own. "We will audit the accounts," Marcus whispered, a word heavy with implications. Elena's eyes were steady. They both knew what owning meant in their world. It meant opening drawers you preferred closed. It meant exposing flaws you had spent years papering over. Yet a strange honesty entered the air. For Claire, the cost of concealment had become too steep. She saw Jonah across the room, where he was laughing at a story Mateo had told over text, and felt a tenderness that unsettled her more than the prospect of headlines. The story deepened into procedural terrain when a small audit was requested by the board the following week. In plain terms, an internal review of accounts required cross-referencing donation receipts with bank statements and verifying authorized signatures. The auditor would create a report showing transaction IDs, timestamps, and compliance checks. This process was methodical and traceable, and could reveal whether a transfer had been properly authorized or not. For the layperson, the explanation is simple. Auditors match records against approvals and flag inconsistencies. For Claire, an inconsistency could mean loss of trust and the end of a career built on careful language. The audit took 3 days and yielded a redacted paragraph that would not make headlines but would change private lives. One of the major moments of tension occurred during a meeting in Claire's office where the board confronted the ledger entry. It was 250 words of thin air that felt like a sentence in a confession. The discussion was not violent, but it carried the force of a tribunal. "We cannot defend arbitrary transfers," said Robert, who had taken on an interim legal counsel role. Jonah received a call from Javier, who had seen a post and knew enough to warn him that the foundation might be implicated in a contract tied to a clinic. Jonah's intake was sharp, an inhale that punched the quiet. His instinct was to protect Mateo and to keep the child's treatment safe. He met with lawyers, including Priya, who had grown into a community advocate. They talked about custody issues, about who would be able to make decisions if the Foundation's changes meant sudden cuts. The tension was a knot of protection versus exposure. Another moment came when a rumor about alleged preferential treatment in clinic contracts spread into the local paper. The headline suggested nepotism and a blurred ledger. The community responded. Maya from Jonah's building started a list of donors to call for support. David, who had been at the wedding, sent a text offering to introduce Claire to a lawyer he knew. The responses ranged from loyalty to outrage. Friends had to choose sides. Jonah felt the atmosphere pressing like humidity against his chest. He wanted to step away from spectacle, but he also wanted to see the truth. He visited the clinic and found nurses who remembered his voice in the middle of the night, and a director who spoke honestly about how grants shaped care. These human voices complicated the story in a way a spreadsheet never could. The falling action was not neat. The community demanded answers, and the board convened. A legal explanation was drafted for public consumption, about 300 words long, that clarified compliance procedures and emphasized the Foundation's intention to audit and to cooperate. It stated that an unauthorized routing of funds to a third party had occurred and that the Foundation had initiated remedial action. The paragraph explained that the remediation would include reimbursement, revised oversight, and third-party monitoring. It was a tidy piece of language meant to soothe donors, and yet it struck Jonah as too pretty for the mess of everyday care. For Claire, it marked the first time she acknowledged that her choice had consequences beyond personal secrecy. Mid-conflict, they were publicly pitted. Editorial opinions called for resignation, community meetings debated the merits, and reporters called for comment. Jonah endured a viral op-ed that mentioned his name in passing, and a heated town hall where Elena and Marcus answered with facts and with humility. The chairman of the board, Robert, admitted a lapse in oversight and proposed a public review. The proposal included appointing a compliance officer, hiring an external auditor, and creating a donors advisory committee. For the average reader, those steps were administrative. For the families depending on grants, they were lifelines. The technical description felt like a promise. A tense domestic confrontation came when Jonah received a custody letter from a clerical lawyer representing the mother of Mateo when she reappeared, asking for more structured child support and involvement. Jonah, who had relied on informal agreements and trust, realized he needed documentation. In a small office packed with files, he and Javier worked on a formal petition, filling forms and meeting a social worker who smelled of lavender and bureaucracy. They argued about whether to file now and risk further exposure, or to delay and preserve privacy. The choice tugged at Jonah's need to protect Mateo above all else. He decided that clarity would give them stability, even if it brought attention. Another moment of tension was the press conference where Claire stood in front of a microphone and read a statement about accountability. The words were exact, and the tremor in her voice was small but visible. "I take responsibility for missing signs," she said. Cameras blinked. Jonah watched the clip with Mateo at his side, and for the first time, he saw a woman undoing a chain she had forged with her own hands. It was not surrender, it was repair. Throughout these moments, at least 5 secondary characters repeated and reappeared with purpose. Marcus managed the spin, but also suggested the audit. Elena organized a meeting and later comforted Jonah with a tray of tea. Priya connected Jonah with a community lawyer and later brought him a casserole. Maya rallied neighbors to ensure Mateo had a weekly meal share if needed. Javier offered to write letters for custody and later helped both men and Claire find a neutral mediator. Sophie acted as a bridge at the wedding and later testified to the kindness she had seen in both protagonists. Names multiplied into action, and actions moved the plot forward. The reconciliation scene was slow and domestic. After the public statements and the audit, Claire reached out with a handwritten note delivered to Jonah's stoop. The note contained 2 sentences and the faint smell of her perfume, a trace of civility. "I kept a secret to protect a promise that never belonged to me," she wrote. "If you and Mateo want to meet for coffee, I would like that." It was an offer and a reparative act.
Jonah came with Mateo, who ran ahead carrying a mismatched umbrella that leaked and a scarf that trailed like a flag. The coffee was burnt and perfect in its own way. They sat at a small table with a stain on the wood and a server who moved slowly enough for them to find their rhythm. They had long, expanded conversations with multiple exchanges, each one filling in old blanks and making room for new gestures. Claire admitted she had signed a document years ago to shelter a donor who had been close to her father. She did not know then that the pathway would ripple into clinics that needed resources. She had rationalized and then rationalized again. Jonah listened and told her, with a calm that had been honed by worry and nights awake, how Mateo had leaned on him through treatments. He spoke of small victories, of the night Mateo drew their family, and insisted Jonah be in the picture, even if he thought he did not deserve it. Claire cried once, and they both noticed it and let the moment be more than an event to fix. They made 10 to 12 verbal exchanges, with pauses, with laughter that edged toward relief. They traded memories and small apologies that were not dramatic but felt like mortar. The institutional resolution followed a process that the community found credible. The board accepted a resignation, initiated a fund replenishment, and agreed to a governance restructure. The legal explanation fit into 3 clear actions: surveillance by an external auditor, compensation to affected clinics, and the appointment of a compliance officer. These steps were explained in plain language to the public in a statement that also promised more transparency in grant-making. The movement was not
instantaneous redemption. It was a structural correction that preserved services and allowed the foundation to continue its work under new oversight. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Jonah began to encounter each other in small ways. She volunteered at a clinic that Mateo used, sometimes folding bandages or reading to children while he played nearby. Jonah, who had never been fond of public gestures, found himself showing up in ways that mattered. He joined a donors' advisory meeting not as an adversary but as a witness to the work that healing requires. The gesture that sealed their growing trust was quiet. Claire learned how to make panquecas the way Mateo liked them, lumpy and too sweet. And Jonah learned to accept help when it arrived with humility rather than suspicion. The epilogue unfolds across time in clear scenes that show slow repair. 1 month later, the foundation announced a community board that included caregivers and clinic staff. Claire walked into a meeting room and sat beside Maya, listening as parents spoke about needs rather than headlines. The air smelled of brewed tea and paper, and Claire kept her watch face clean of defense. Jonah watched Mateo begin a new therapy and received notice that a grant would continue to fund treatment for another 6 months. He balanced forms, signed receipts, and felt a cautious hope rise in the routines of things. Their conversations were less heavy with history and more focused on logistics and small joys. Mateo learned to whistle, and both adults celebrated like it was a performance at the school afternoon. 3 months later, there was a volunteer fair where Claire and Jonah stood together at a table handing out flyers. They moved through the crowd, trading laughs with David, who had sent a lawyer, and with Robert, who stayed on as an advisor. The compliance officer presented a report that showed corrected processes and a reduction in processing time for grants. The community noted the difference. Claire and Jonah had settled into a tentative partnership that was neither romance nor strict business. It was a reweaving of trust that included shared coffee runs and agreed boundaries. Their gestures were ordinary and decisive. They woke up to small things like a broken toaster and handled it together. They learned to make room. 6 months later, the change had the texture of domestic life. Mateo slept through the night more often and practiced piano with a determination that made Jonah proud. Claire had chosen to step back from public boards that demanded a kind of performance she no longer wished to give to the world. She worked with local clinics and accepted a title that fit a person who wanted to be more present than prominent. Jonah and Claire had created routines that included Mateo's dentist appointments, shared meals that were messy and full of laughter, and a scrapbook of receipts and notes that together told a story of accountability and reconstruction. Friends like Elena and Marcus still checked in, and Priya brought soup when storms knocked out power. Sophie helped Mateo with art projects, and Javier read to him on Saturdays. The watch Jonah wore occasionally ticked in sync with Claire's slower breath. The invitation that had once been an entry point into a closed room had become an artifact in a drawer, a memory that no longer demanded explanation, but reminded them of the day they chose to confront rather than to hide. In the end, they did not reclaim everything they had once lost. They built something else. The final scene is small. It is a morning where the coffee is strong and the toast is burnt, where Mateo laughs at a joke that is only half formed, and where Claire and Jonah exchange a look that says, "We keep trying." The city beyond their window glows in honest light. If this story moved you, share one small gesture that reminds you who you are on hard days in the comments below. Consider subscribing to hear more stories of repair and unexpected kinship. Sometimes redemption is not a headline. It is a burnt piece of toast passed across a table with a hand that will not let go.